Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Sarah Cottrell-Propst, and I'm the Executive Director of the Interwest Energy Alliance and your moderator for the next hour or so. Today's webinar was organized by the Four Corners Wind Resource Center, which is a virtual collaboration between Utah Clean Energy, Northern Arizona University, and the Interwest Energy Alliance. And this center is one of 6 Department of Energy funded centers around the United States established to provide unbiased wind energy information to communities and decision makers. In addition to the DOE funding, our center is supported by the Utah Governor's Office of Energy Development. The organization that I work for, the Interwest Energy Alliance, is a regional nonprofit trade association focused on the deployment of a reliable, cost-effective, and diverse portfolio of renewable energy resources in the interior West. Our members include the nation's leading renewable energy developers, manufacturers, and advocacy groups. Today's webinar is intended to enhance understanding of the functions and benefits of regional electricity markets. To give you a window into why Interwest is very interested in expansion of electricity markets in the West, we believe that if they're designed correctly, markets can facilitate much greater deployment of renewable energy. Our presenters today are going to explain why that's the case. Along with our national partner, the American Wind Energy Association, AWEA, Interwest has submitted a series of comments regarding the ISO expansion proceeding in California and the Pacific Core states of Utah and Wyoming, and we've promoted other market expansion activities in Nevada, Arizona, and the other states where we operate. Our first presenter for the webinar today will be Amanda Ormond. Amanda is the Managing Director of the Western Grid Group. She also works with Interwest as our Four Corners Wind Resource Center consultant, helping to design webinars like this one and educational initiatives on wind energy. For over a decade, she has managed the Ormond Group LLC, a consulting firm that specializes in education, advocacy, and lobbying for clean energy. Prior to that, Amanda served as Director of the Arizona Energy Office for 7 years. Amanda will provide an overview of the operations and services of regional energy markets, as well as current development efforts. Our second presenter today will be Johnny Cassana, the Senior Regional Manager for Government and Regulatory Affairs at EDP Renewables. Johnny is a board member of the Interwest Energy Alliance, and at EDPR, he oversees political strategies and lobby efforts at the local, state, and federal levels, advocating for increased renewable energy throughout the West. He lives in Portland, Oregon, holds a degree from Reed College, has experience developing wind and solar energy, and has worked in federal science policy with the National Science and Technology Council in Washington, D.C. Today, Johnny will discuss how a regional market supports and lowers the cost of integrating renewable energy. So as we get started, I wanted to let everybody know how we're going to handle the Q&A portion of today's webinar. As we move through the webinar, please submit your comments by typing them in the questions box. We are not going to use the hand-raising tool, so again, please type your questions in the box. I'll collect them and we'll field all the questions for both presenters after they have completed their remarks. I'd also like to note that this webinar will be recorded and posted on the Four Corners Wind Resource Center website for future reference. So with that, Amanda, it's your turn.
Thank you, Sarah. Advancing slides. So I'm going to talk about a couple different things today. I want to give you a general overview of what the market operations are, the functions of an independent system operator or a regional transmission organization, and then I'm going to talk about some of the different proposals that are out there right now, and then discuss some of the concerns and what's being studied, so you know where the status is. So first, what is a regional transmission system? They're known by a couple different names. They're known as an independent system operator or a regional transmission organization. In the California region, it's also, they've coined the term a regional system operator. These are essentially all the same types of organizations, and they are independent organizations that are meant to manage and help plan the high voltage transmission system. So they don't have anything to do with the local distribution system. It's the high voltage transmission system, and these organizations are in geographic footprints for the utilities that join them. And the majority of the utilities in the United States are part of RTOs. So what are the functions? There basically are 4 primary functions for these ISOs and RTOs. Manage power flows, so to make sure that there's enough transmission and transmission capacity available across the entire footprint to make sure that power can get from wherever it is to wherever it needs to be. They also do the actual dispatch of generating units. So if there's coal and natural gas and nuclear plants all throughout the footprint, the ISO is the entity that controls what generators turn on when within the footprint. They also are the platform for market trading, so buying and selling of energy, bidding in of different energy. This is an important function because this can help achieve economic efficiencies by getting competition in the marketplace. And then another function that they provide is long-term planning. So we need to make sure that we are starting to plan for and contract for and pay for generating units that we're going to need a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So how does the current system operate? The picture on the left is a picture of the Western Interconnection, and there are 38 different utilities, or the more accurate term is balancing authorities, within the Western Interconnection. And the Western Interconnection is the electrical interconnection. It's everything that you see on the screen is electrically interconnected. The term balancing authority means that an entity that's responsible for keeping the loads and resources in balance at any given time. So there's 38 of those in the West. And if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, what it shows is that individual balancing authorities only have their own resources to pull on to meet their load peaks. And so if I'm utility ABC, I might have 10 generators. I only have my 10 generators to pull on. I can't reach across and ask somebody else to help support my system if I have any kind of outage or problem. So what would change in an RTO? The picture on the left shows that if we are sharing resources, then I may have 10 generators and my neighbor may have 10 generators, and then we can share those resources. The West has always had some sharing going on. In the past, the Southwest has provided excess generation to the Northwest when they had their cold winters, and then in the summers when the Southwest needs the most power, they've bought power from the Northwest. So regional sharing has always gone on. This would be a more formal process. On the right-hand side, the red, that is the actual geography of the Western Interconnection where we're all electrically tied. We could build a system operator that covers that entire geography. We're not considering that right now, but that's possible. Okay, so RTOs exist in most places in the country. They're not in the southeast and they're not in the west, but if you look at the map, they are in most every other place in the country. So these are a normal operating system for the electrical industry, both here and in Europe and other parts of the world. So benefits of an RTO. Improved reliability. If I have access to other generators that I can pull on, if my generators go off, or if there is a tree that falls on the transmission line and I don't have that transmission line, my system is inherently more reliable. There also is a lot more interconnectedness and what we call visibility into the system, so I can actually see what's happening on the system any given period, any point in the system, so I can look and try to hedge against problems that may be arising. There's more economic dispatch of resources. As I said earlier, now you've got these huge pool of resources that the ISO can pull from to be able to meet the load. And if there's lots of wind and solar, those are the zero-cost resources. So those can help lower the overall economic cost of serving generation in the ISO. For renewable energy, when wind plants are spread across a wide geography, you have a smoothing because you can smooth the weather variability, and you have diversity of weather, so the wind is always blowing somewhere. So that's a great benefit of renewables. And then really importantly, it's reducing the amount of reserves that a utility has to hold. it's required that utilities have at least 15% reserves, generation reserves sitting on the sidelines in case something happens in the system. That's really expensive to carry those excess reserves. If you think about it, if you had a business and you had 15% of your excess people just sat there and did nothing all day, how expensive that is. So when you get to share and have a larger geography, you get to share the amount of reserves, which means everybody has to carry less. So there's some huge cost savings there. And I do want to mention that in the current discussions that's going on with regionalization, nobody is really doubting the benefits of regional transmission organizations. The discussion is much more about how do we make this work, who pays for what, how do we change the system. But the basic premise of the efficiency and financial gains are really not in question. So I'm going to skip the next two slides that are about specifics of wind and solar benefits because Johnny Cassana from EDP Renewables is going to cover that. But let me just close this section with this slide. Southwestern Power Pool is one of the newer RTOs in the country. They formed back in 2014, and they had put out a press release in October that stated their benefits. And they have very carefully tracked their benefits. SPP started very organically. A number of utilities got together and decided that if they pooled resources and they started planning together and sharing resources, that there would be benefits. What they reported in September is that they have saved $1 billion in their 2 years worth of operation. And you can see that it's a large geography. It includes 14 states, but that's a really significant number for savings in 2 years. So let me switch and talk about what's actually happening and developing in the West. So first, there is a proposal called the Mountain West Transmission Group, and the picture there shows the geography. The big players in the group are Tri-State Generation and Transmission, Western Area Power Administration, XL, which is Public Service of Colorado. These 7 utilities have started working together actually since 2013 to see whether they could find efficiency gains and save money. And they have been considering joining some of the markets that exist to the east of us, which is the Mid-Continent ISO or the Southwestern Power Pool. This geography, these states, Colorado sits on the eastern side of the Western Interconnection, so they actually touch these other ISOs, so they could join them if they wanted to. So they've been working for quite a while on this proposal. I will say that the proposal and this work group has been very private. They haven't had any public meetings. They haven't talked to public utility commissioners. They haven't invited stakeholders in. So this proposal has become public just in the last couple months, and so there's a lot to digest and there's a lot to understand about what they're proposing. But they have done quite a bit of work. So they did first a transmission cost study, and they looked at what happens if we created a common transmission tariff. So instead of having to pay for transmission service every time you cross somebody else's boundary, what happens if you had just one transmission tariff? So they looked at doing that together, and they found that there would be benefits there. They went further and they put out a request for information to different RTOs to say, okay, what happens if you manage the full complement of services that I mentioned earlier, helping us do planning, actually operating the system, doing the wholesale market transactions. So they put out a request for information to SPP, to the California Independent System Operator, to the Mid-Continent System Operator, and also PJM, which is in the Mid-Atlantic region. They put out a bid asking for those entities to provide services to them. They wanted to see what the cost would be. And then they also did some market studies where they quantified the benefits of doing this joint tariff, and they also looked at this full day-ahead markets. What I've heard and presented last month was that they see benefit in going to a full organized market in some form or fashion. So they've already done their analysis. They are starting negotiations with different RTOs. They expect those negotiations to be done in early 17, and they're just now at the process where they're starting to go out and actually talk to people about what they're proposing. This has been a very different process than what's been happening out of California, because the utilities put their heads together, decided what they wanted, collected a lot of information. Now they're going out for public input. The next RTO I'm going to talk about has done it very differently. They've gone out for lots of public input on the front end. So the Mountain West Transmission Group expects to be seeking federal and state approval in mid to late 2017, and that they'll go live sometime in late 18 or early 19. So it's a pretty dramatic proposal, and it's been pretty quiet up until now. So now let me shift and talk about the Western Regional System Operator. So PacifiCorp, which is in 6 states, has joined with the California Independent System Operator in a platform called the Energy Imbalance Market. You may have heard of it. And it is a 5-minute market. And because PacifiCorp did that, they realized that there were a lot of savings possible through regionalization and working within a market. So that led them to think about, should we look at this day-ahead full market services where it's operations planning and wholesale market transaction. It's basically the same process that the Mountain States Transmission Group just went through. They looked at a little piece and said, hey, that has benefits, now let's look at something bigger. So if PacifiCorp and the California Independent System Operator decide to build a regional system operator, it would mean that we would go from a one-state regional transmission organization, which is what California has now, to a multi-state regional transmission organization. So we would form a whole new one. And just as a point of information, Texas has its own one-state RTO, and New York has its own one-state RTO. So those 3 states, California, New Mexico, and California, Texas, and New York have single-state ones, and then the rest of the RTOs are multi-state. So what's happening in the development process? Well, if you move from a single state to a multi-state, we need to talk about a lot of the rules and processes and policies, and there's a couple listed here. Resource adequacy is a term you'll hear. Resource adequacy is ensuring that you have enough generation planned and brought onto the system to meet whatever the needs are going to be in the next 6 months, year, 5 years. And so that is the planning process to make sure that the ISO has enough generation to be able to meet load. The transmission access charge is, what do people have to pay to get on the system? If it's like a toll road. I want to drive down the New Jersey Turnpike, I pay a toll. If I want to get on the regional transmission organization system, I have to pay a charge. The concern here is, for states that don't have a TAC right now, what would be the fees that they would have to pay, and how would that impact the cost of their customers? Governance. This is probably the biggest issue that's out there right now. Who has decision-making authority in this new organization should it form? Who sits in the chair? Who makes decisions? Who controls the money? That's one of the really big things that needs to be decided. The grid management charge is basically, how do you pay for the organization? How do you pay for the RSO? The staff, the planning, all those types of functions. And then another issue that's come up in the California PAC process is greenhouse gas tracking. You are probably aware that California, Oregon, and Washington all have strong carbon-related goals, policy goals, but some of the other states like Wyoming do not. And so how do you track greenhouse gases across this broader footprint? The states that have greenhouse gas goals really want to know, are they meeting their goals? Other states that don't have these policies don't necessarily need that information and don't want to pay for having to collect or monitor that information. So that's something that's going to be decided as we move forward. So quickly on approval processes. California Independent System Operator, which is the RTO that exists in the West right now, is a creature of the California legislature. The California legislature has to passed legislation saying that it can change into a regional organization. This is the first and maybe the biggest hurdle, is that California has to give up control, because no state is going to join a RTO that is actually controlled by only one state. That just doesn't make sense. So the California legislature has to act. Then the CAISO, the California Independent System Operator, has to finish the initiatives that I just talked about: resource adequacy, transmission access charge, greenhouse gas, and the like. We need to change those processes from a one-state to a multi-state process. Then California ISO has to go to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and seek approval. FERC has to approve whether this RTO is in the best interest and follows the guidelines that they've set up for these types of organizations. And then if FERC approves, then Cal ISO would cease to be a single state and would move to a multi-state regional transmission organization. At the same time, PacifiCorp, which is a utility that operates in 6 states, it doesn't list Colorado on the top of this slide, California, but it includes California. PacifiCorp actually has to do benefit studies for each of its individual states. If I'm sitting in the state of Utah, I want to know, are there actual financial benefits that will benefit my customers or not? And so individual state studies have to be done, and PacifiCorp is the one that has to do that. Then if those are successful, PacifiCorp has to file with the individual states, and each and every state is going to go through a review process to make sure that it is in the public interest for their customers. PacifiCorp would then, if that is approved, then they would file at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for what they call a change of control. As I mentioned earlier, the ISO has control of the different generators in their footprint. So instead of PacifiCorp in Utah having control of a coal generator, now the independent system operator would have control of that generator. So that's a big shift. And then assuming that all those approvals are met, then PacifiCorp would actually go into the implementation phase, and they would have to install software and hardware and train their people to be able to operate the system. I see I've got a typo. And then I have here that the system might go live in 2019. That's the last date that I've heard, an official date, but we know that that's going to slip just based on where the process is. Okay, so the FERC approval process. FERC passed an order called Order 2000 that sets up minimum criteria that RTOs have to have. FERC has supported RTO formation because of reliability, because of cost savings, and because of efficiency. So they have a whole process that you have to go through to gain their approval. So FERC would review proposals from PacifiCorp as well as the Cal ISO. Okay, so now let me shift and talk about what are some of the concerns, or what are some of the issues that have been raised in this whole RTO development process, both at the Mountain West and California. So first is loss of state control. If I'm the state of any one of the states that are in an RTO, I think about, I have my Public Utility Commission, I determine what resources the utility are going to build, I figure out how it's paid for, and on down the road we go. If I am going to move to a regional system operator, what control am I going to lose? Am I going to still be able to implement my state policies? Am I going to be more subject to federal jurisdiction on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission? So this is a primary concern for states, and I think that there's been lots of good information put out there about what won't happen, and sometimes there's more concern about things we don't know about, and once we dig into the details, we realize that it's not as dire as maybe we thought first. Governance, as I mentioned, a very important issue. One, any regional organization has to be independent from the California legislature. There needs to be a definitive role for state regulators or state entities to be able to impact how the system operates. And then in most RTOs around the world, I think most all of them, they are actually governed by an independent board. So the independent board is experts that are expert in the operation and market and trading of the system. They're not a representative of a particular state or a particular company, so they're independent, which gives them the ability to plan and operate the best system. Costs are obviously a concern. What is the net benefit to the state? There is a cost to a utility joining an RSO or RTO because they have to add metering to their generating units, they have to train their personnel, change their software. So there's cost to it. What is the overall benefit? And then what is the cost of overall electricity? Is my cost going to go down or up? California is a high-cost electricity state. Most of the other states, or many of the other states, are not. And so how is that going to equalize? States don't want to add costs to their ratepayers, so that's a really important consideration. And then also what's come up is, are the financial benefits going to actually accrue to the customers? Or do the financial benefits just stop at the utility and don't actually flow down to the customers? Okay, impact on jobs. Most states want renewable energy development or want development in their states. They want the jobs. California has very specific rules about building renewable energy in the state of California, a preference there. If we move to regional organizations, what happens to the jobs? Where do they go? It's a concern. Environmental interests, the greenhouse gases that I mentioned. Is the regional system operator going to make the electricity system cleaner? I believe it will. I think the studies have shown that it will, because you're going to more easily put on vast amounts of clean energy. Okay, so the California legislature last year passed a bill. It was called Senate Bill 350, and it was meant to direct it did direct the California Independent System Operator, CAISO, to begin studying what regionalization meant to California, and California only. And so there was a whole bunch of direction given to study emissions, impact on vulnerable communities, economics, jobs, and a whole host of other things. CAISO put together these studies. There were 4 consultants. I think they produced 12 different volumes, like, I don't even know, 400 pages worth of documentation about what are the costs and benefits. And I've got some of the benefits reported on the slide. $1.5 billion by 2030 for California ratepayers only, and then creation of jobs and investment in wind and solar. At the very end of the webinar, there's a website, and Western Grid Group has led an effort with a number of different NGOs that looked at some of the benefits that were not quantified by these SB 350 studies, because they were very broad, but for example, they didn't quantify what are the reliability benefits. What we found is that there's an additional $500 million worth of potential unquantified benefits through 2030. So these studies were good, they were robust, but they don't cover everything. On this slide, I've got some additional information about what was studied. There were less impacts on land because you're doing less transmission building overall. The amount of air pollution and toxics went down. There were economic benefits to disadvantaged communities, lower costs, better visibility in the system, and it did make it easier to integrate renewables in the system. Okay, so I want to show this timeline. This timeline is the latest that's been published, but it's not accurate, so I apologize for that. But what I wanted to show you is that the 350 studies and the policy initiatives of resource adequacy, TAC, governance, greenhouse gas, are all happening at the same time. So it's been an amazing amount of work and initiatives and webinars and white papers and filings that have gone on to date. So all of that is going to happen in some timeline. And then once that's concluded, the California legislature hopefully will act at some of that time, and then PacifiCorp will go forward and do the studies they need to do and talk to the states. So, the first part is getting everything in order. The second part is going to take the approvals. And what this chart is showing is that it may take over a year to get state approvals. And then after that, it's going to take somewhere upwards of a year to actually implement. So the go live date of sometime in 19 will not hold. Okay, last slide. What's expected in 2017? The California legislature did not act last year to authorize California moving to a regional system. That has to happen for anything to move forward. So we expect that that might happen in 2017. California ISO has to complete the TAC and RA processes and all those that I talked about. Where things stand, the current discussion is that there probably will be some transitional committee or some interim form of government formed. There are so many details, so many interlocking processes that something will be authorized to be a bridge between where we are now and the final authorization. Net benefit studies will be conducted for states, we think likely in 2017. And then a question mark in my mind is, will we get far enough that if all those other things happen, that there will be FERC filings in state filings in 2017. So that's my last slide. I want to leave this up here for more information where you can go. There are fact sheets. There is information on the additional benefits that are unquantified at all of these sites. So Sarah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. And I want to remind everybody that the way to ask questions of our presenters is to type your question into the question box on the right of your screen, and we'll compile those and field them all at the end after Johnny has concluded his presentation. But our next presenter is Johnny Cassana with EDPR.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the chance for being here.
One more.
We can move on. Yeah. So before I get into specifically the wind and solar piece, I do like to, I get really excited about this stuff, and I like to throw up a picture of the U.S. at night, because I think it really illustrates in a real sort of gut and visual way the unique challenges that the West faces. You can almost see where the Western Interconnect begins, based on just where those lights are, and how disparate and vast and sparsely populated our side of the country is compared to the dense, centers of industry that have already implemented these kind of system operators. Amanda? Good. Yeah. So there you are. You have the three different interconnects that are all one single machine. And I also like to throw up. I don't know if you can read those very well, but I throw up just the sort of raw numbers of how many states and the population and the nameplate capacity of these big system operators like MISO and SAP and PJM. They're roughly equivalent to the number of states that are in the Western Interconnect. Populations are similar. The nameplate capacities are in the same range. But all of these ISOs are able to do it with one balancing authority, one mind, one optimized IT system, and one set of communication standards. Whereas we have, like Amanda mentioned, 38, which is, gut check. Seems like we're doing something wrong. We're missing out. Yeah, so these ISOs, they're saving money, increase grid efficiency, they reduce waste, enable wind and solar. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now. So why does an ISO matter in the West for wind and solar? First thing is that utility scale wind and solar are cheaper than gas and coal. And I feel like I have to say this every chance I get, because it's relatively new. That wasn't true 5 years ago, it wasn't true 10 years ago. But it is true now, and I have some numbers up here from Lazard in terms of the levelized cost of energy. You can do the next slide. But it's not just about cheap electrons, and that's, of course, part of the problem. Wind and solar look and feel different than conventional thermal generation. A lot of the systems and standards that are set up to actually manage our grid and do the work of the grid have a hard time accounting for the abundant opportunity in low-cost, low-carbon wind and solar. And a broad regional grid is something that really helps realize that full value. And I have it right there on the right-hand side there, a sort of representation of that path trickle control areas, which really isn't set up very well to benefit from the sharing like Amanda was describing. Go to the next slide. There's another study that Union of Concerned Scientists did about a year ago, which is really a great piece of work, looking specifically at when you change a system, 10%, 15%, it's mostly noise in the system, and the rest of that machine can keep picking up the slack for actually doing the work. But when you talk about a 50% renewable standard, you're changing out the shape and feel of the electricity for half or more of the energy in a grid. You actually need that energy to do the work of the system, provide the reliability and the ancillary services. And this is one of the real major challenges. And the study that UCS put out looks at comparing what the grid looks like in terms of cost and actual carbon output if you enable renewables to serve things like reliability and load following reserves, which are services that require some kind of a regional footprint or regional RSO, and compare that to plugging a lot of renewables in and then not changing how you source your reliability and just ramping up gas plants double or quadruple. And what they found was at those high levels, at the 50 or 60% penetration, it is much cheaper and more economic to have the renewables do the work as well as provide the energy, not just plug in energy and ask the other 50% to do all of the work. Move on. So beyond just cheap, one of the things that I always think about is that in the next 10 years, there's about 5.5 gigawatts of coal plants that are slated to retire. This is mainly because they're old machines from the 60s and 70s, and just like an old junker car, need to be replaced. And that means that the next decade or so is going to be a real important period of deciding what our grid is going to look like, and the decisions that we make in the next 10 years are going to have a pretty major impact on what our grid looks like for the next century. And in the absence of some kind of regional coordination from either the Mountain West or the proposal that CAISO put forward, or something else that resembles the functionality of those proposals, it will be very difficult to replace that amount of coal with anything except baseload natural gas. But in the context of a liquid fluid market, like you would have with a regional RSO, wind and solar, because they're so cheap and because they can provide those reliability services if you ask for them, become the clear winner from an economic perspective. And that leads to much less fuel price volatility, lower carbon impact, and also, and this is I think a real critical point, sets the electric grid up to be the baseline for decarbonizing other sectors like transportation and the built environment. And if you don't start with a clean grid, it's nearly impossible to get those sectors decarbonized to the degree that some states in the West have already set standards to try to achieve. Next slide. And the third major driver is California, and one of the reasons that matters a lot. And I like to think about scale when I think about these issues. California is over 60% of the Western Energy Coordinating Council in terms of load. It's a larger economy than France. It imports over 25% of its power. That's not a really commonly talked about statistic, but it's true and it's real. And what that means is that the choices that California makes have a big impact on its neighbors because we have a Western interconnect grid that is, the wires are all connected even if the operators aren't talking to each other. And these markets are interconnected. The consulting firm E3 has done a lot of work for the state in terms of analyzing how to achieve goals like the 50% RPS and the carbon targets that are set for 2030 and 2050. And one of the conclusions they put forward is that in order to actually achieve the ambitious, aggressive carbon reduction targets in California, that state will need to do a litany of things, including getting about 60% of its energy from renewables. If you can move on to the next slide. And where does that come from? The path to 50 or 60% for California, if it's going to be done anywhere close to economic, always goes through working with its neighbors. You know, Amanda mentioned this also. There have been studies demonstrating that, you know, pairing that very high caliber wind in the mountain states with the California solar and Arizona solar makes both of those resources stronger and can save California customers about $1 billion or $1.5 billion per year, just because of the efficiencies that you get, because you don't have to build out as much transmission, because you don't need to buy as much fuel for running your resource adequacy reserves. These are the sorts of efficiencies and cost savings that really add up, that are a really essential part of realizing the dreams that have already been put forward into law and statute in that state. And what that means is that in the context of a regional ISO or some sort of similar functionality, there's massive opportunity for economic development throughout the WECC. And you know, that is the sort of opportunity that matters a lot to wind and solar developers, that I know from my work in rural communities matters a lot to those community members, and it's something that, you know, we're doing everything we can to see come to fruition. So, unlock the value of wind, lay the foundation for renewables, help replace coal, and help states meet their carbon RPS goals economically. And get some steel in the ground while you're at
it. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Amanda. We've had some good questions come in. A couple of reminders: if you have questions based on these presentations, please type them into the question box. We also had a question about whether these presentations will be available, and the answer is yes. The webinar is being recorded. It will be available at www.fourcornerswind.org/webinars. So thanks for that question. This is a question that I think either Amanda or Johnny could take. Can you elaborate on why integration into an RSO reduces reserve requirement?
So if you, I'll take a stab, and then Johnny, you can go after me.
Sure.
If you have a 15% requirement, and I have to meet that 15% requirement myself, I have to build and hold that amount. But if you have a wider geography, then maybe I can hold 5% and someone else can hold 5% and someone else can hold 5%. If you have electrical interconnection and the electronics to be able to share that power, then I can get that power from one point to another when I need to. Right now, there are some reserve sharing pools. So I'm more familiar with the Southwest because I live in Arizona. But there are reserve sharing pools. So if I'm a utility and I'm in trouble because my power plant tripped off, I have written agreements with others around me that I can go buy energy from them. But energy right now is traded on the hour. So I can say on the top of the hour, hey, I need, 450 or say 450 megawatts for the next 2 hours, but I can only do that on an hourly basis. It's very inflexible. When you're in a modern RTO, you can buy and sell power on a 5-minute basis, and so and I can actually get that power delivered because now I'm electrically or I'm connected to these other balancing authorities. So it means that I don't have to have all those generators sitting in my geographic footprint. They can be next door to me, and I can access them just as quickly as if they were in my footprint. I'm not sure if that was clear or not.
I think that's spot on, Amanda. And and there's another I think layer that I would add to, which is those reserves are the most expensive and difficult part of managing your grid and your most limiting factor, and they're based on predicting your worst case scenario, like if that nuke plant turns off, by accident, or if there's an earthquake, like what is the thing that could go wrong that would cause you to need those reserves? And the short of it is that when you have many more options because you're connected to many more grids, the severity of your worst case gets diminished. You know, because before you get to drawing on those reserves, you have a lot more options like that 5-minute market.
Right. And in Arizona, Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station, the largest nuclear generating station in the country, in this region, the largest thing that they plan for happening is losing 1,000 megawatts at any given time, because that's the size of one of the generators. So we have to carry, you know, reserves to be able to deal with losing 1,000 megawatts, which is significant.
So this is a question for Johnny. Can you explain if wind will be procured differently if a regional market is formed versus how it's done today through utility procurement processes?
You know, procurement is something that doesn't necessarily follow from the RSO. You know, it could be procured the same way. It could be procured in a different way. I think that what's important to take away from the impact of an ISO is that it creates more options for utilities or any other entity that's looking to serve an energy need. In the physical market that we have right now, if you want to go beyond the service territory of your balancing authority to source energy from any generation type, that generator needs to own the transmission or own rights along the transmission lines, and that's what we call a bilateral or a physical market. That creates a scarcity problem. It's highly uneconomical, and it's extremely inefficient. In the context of a single balancing authority that's optimizing available transmission to available generation and load needs, you know, with high-tech IT software and real-time communication from lots of data points all throughout the system, anywhere that you interconnect on that system is available to anywhere else within that system. You don't need to go through the rigmarole and the effort and the cost of securing bilateral transmission rights. So I think the short of it is that in the context of an RSO, there's more choices available to those procuring energy, and that's part of the reason that the economics of wind are better realized.
And if I can tag on to that, so the way I understand the resource adequacy process is the California Independent System Operator, if it became a regional organization, they are going to look at, they're going to get from individual states and utilities what they think their load projections are going to be, and then they plan what they think is needed for the system. Individual utilities and the public service commissions or public utility commissions still do the job they have always done about, you know, planning and building and doing procurement of resources. Those are then fed up to the regional system. Certainly the regional system impacts what's built, because they may say, hey, we need generation over here, or we need fast starting generation, or we need this and that. But the bidding, utilities still will go through, you know, a process that they go through, and the states will still go through the process they go through. That is just fed up to the regional system.
Yeah.
We have a question here regarding regulatory process and approvals, and the question is, does presumably Mountain West Transmission Group faces the same regulatory hurdles as the Western RSO? Do they likewise need buy-in from each affected state's utility commission and/or legislature and/or the FERC, et cetera? Amanda, maybe we could start with you on that question.
Yes, and the short answer is yes. The two processes, they're so interesting to look at how they've formed and how they've been done differently. The thing that's been amazing to me with the California ISO process is that there's a lot of political involvement, and partially that's because the California legislature has to act, and now there's discussion about other legislatures have to act. When you look at the formation of other RTOs around the country, legislatures never got involved because this was agreements between utilities and their regulators. You know, this is most of it is so down in the weeds and technically challenging that to me is the appropriate places for decisions to be made. We have heard discussions about, well, the legislature has to also authorize, you know, states to move forward. That just doesn't make logical sense to me. I don't think legislatures have the decision. It's just going to be difficult. So the California process has been very political. Most RTOs have formed, and they haven't been political at all. The Mountain States Transmission Group has formed, and it's been the utilities deciding what is good for the system, what is good for their customers, and now they're going to take it up through a public process to get input, and eventually it will land at the public utility commissions in all the states, and yes, it will have to go to FERC. And if the Mountain States decide to join Southwest Power Pool, then it's the Southwest Power Pool that actually will go to FERC and amend their tariff and say, you know, this is what we're going to do. We're going to add on, you know, these 7 entities in 3 states or 4 states. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. It does face the same regulatory challenges as ISO in California, but like Amanda was saying, it doesn't face necessarily the same legislative challenges, nor would it really anywhere else except California and its particular history with the energy crisis, you know, 15, 16 years ago, which led to the creation of the system that we have now, sort of a legislator exerting control in a dire crisis time. And I think that if the California ISO weren't set up such that it would take a legislative bill passing through both houses and getting signed by the governor to change governance, I don't think it would be as highly politicized as it has been.
Right, and I guess one last point. Some PUCs think that they don't have the authority to make this decision, and some PUCs think they do. To me, this is a regulatory decision. This is the PUCs have to look out for the best interest of the utilities and the consumers in their state. So that is not a legal opinion, but it's my personal opinion.
Thanks. We have time for a couple more questions. Please feel free to type them into the questions box. We have a couple of questions here regarding the Mountain West Transmission Group effort and the California ISO, Western ISO expansion effort. So I'm going to try to combine these into a question I think both of you could respond to. Does having 2 regional markets as opposed to 1 help or hurt renewable energy development? And let's start with that one, and then we'll do the follow-on one next.
Okay, I'll take a shot. Go ahead, Johnny.
Sure. Well, I think that either one helps, and I think both help. I think that the Mountain West effort, if it comes to fruition, will have a really great impact on sourcing extremely high caliber wind and solar from in and around Colorado and neighboring states to the big load centers there. And I think that would be a really great thing for that part of WEC. And I think that if the California ISO or some other iteration comes to fruition and pairs together, you know, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California, the Northwest, those kind of states which are so closely integrated already or connected already, that would go a really long way in that part of it. I think that if 10 years from now there's sort of 2 competing ISOs that are close to being adjacent, you might see those ISOs talk about merging, and we've certainly seen that in the East. But I think that one is not necessarily better than the other, and having 2 proceeding on separate parallel tracks at 2 edges of WEC, I think is a good thing.
I would answer it this way. I agree with what Johnny just said. We have 38 different balancing authorities right now, so that means there's a term called SEAMs where two different operating entities have to deal with each other, and they have different rules and tariffs and ways that they operate. And so these 38 entities have to deal with all those different people around them. If we created two different ISOs, or the Mountain West folks join something else, we're reducing the number of SEAMs. We're reducing the number of 38 to some smaller number. That has inherent benefits. It creates a seam between Mountain West and whatever, if anything, forms out of California, but that's still better than what we have now. We have a very inefficient system now, so it is moving in the right direction. Somebody had said to me recently, which I kind of got a chuckle out of, that if the Mountain West joins the Southwestern Power Pool, which is a possibility, they actually join that market, then decisions for the state of Colorado will be impacted by what happens in Arkansas. And that just is a little mind-bending to me, because we're used to thinking about just the West.
So Amanda, we had a provocative follow-up question, and you may or may not want to answer this as our last question, but do you have a view as to which RTO it would make the most sense for the Mountain West Transmission Group to join?
Oh, no, I don't have a personal opinion. They're leaning towards the Southwestern Power Pool, I know that. And if you have followed the development of any of these RTOs, Southwestern Power Pool has been very engaged in the West. Early on, they came in and they made proposals to PacifiCorp. They've been engaged with all the Western commissioners. They really have been very thoughtful, and they have been very organic in their forming. So they formed out of the needs and the desires of utilities, and I think they're very well thought of. So I think they're the front runner. I think they're the lead horse.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I don't think that one is necessarily better than the other. When you're dealing with so much dysfunction, anything that smooths that over is a step in the right direction, and potentially a very big step.
So I think
with that we're, oh sorry, Amanda, go ahead.
What I hear, my sense is that this isn't a if this is going to happen, this is a when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. So, folks that have issues and key stakeholders, they need to be engaged, because something will form, and we want to make sure that it works the best for everyone.
So with that, we're approaching the top of the hour, and I would like to thank Amanda Ormond and Johnny Cassana, our presenters, for doing an excellent job today on a very complex set of topics. And thank all of you who joined us as attendees in the webinar. As I mentioned, the webinar is recorded. It will be posted at the fourcornerswind.org website that you see on your screen. Please refer it to colleagues. We do webinars every few months on different topics regarding wind energy in the Western United States, so stay tuned for future webinars from the Four Corners Wind Resource Center. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a good afternoon.